This reading is taken from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 10, verses 2 to 22. The Lord said to the man clothed in linen, "Go in among the wheels beneath the cherubim. Fill your hands with burning coals from among the cherubim and scatter them over the city." And as I watched, he went in. Now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple when the man went in, and a cloud filled the inner court. Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. The cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. The sound of the wings of the cherubim could be heard as far away as the outer court, like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks. When the Lord commanded the man in linen, "Take fire from among the wheels, from among the cherubim," the man went in and stood beside a wheel. Then one of the cherubim reached out his hand to the fire that was among them. He took up some of it and put it into the hands of the man in linen. He took it and went out. Under the wings of the cherubim could be seen what looked like human hands. I looked, and I saw, beside the cherubim, 4 wheels, one beside each of the cherubim. The wheels sparkled like topaz. As for their appearance, the 4 of them looked alike. Each was like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the cherubim faced. The wheels did not turn about as the cherubim went. The cherubim went in whatever direction the head faced, without turning as they went. Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands, and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were their 4 wheels. I heard the wheels being called the whirling wheels. Each of the cherubim had 4 faces. One face was that of a cherub, the second the face of a human being, the third the face of a lion, and the 4th the face of an eagle. Then the cherubim rose upward. These were the living creatures I'd seen by the river Kibar. When the cherubim moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the cherubim spread their wings to rise from the ground, the wheels did not leave their side. When the cherubim stood still, they also stood still. And when the cherubim rose, they rose with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in them. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. While I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground. And as they went, the wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. These were the living creatures I had seen beneath the God of Israel by the river Kibar. And I realized that they were cherubim. Each had 4 faces and 4 wings, and under their wings was what looked like human hands. Their faces had the same appearance as those I'd seen by the river Kibar. Each one went straight ahead.
Well, our thanks to Dennis for our scripture reading today. And as you've gathered, we are taking another look into the writing of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel. Now, this can be quite a difficult book to understand, partly because you do need some appreciation of the historic events that are going on around the prophet, which are themselves quite painful and difficult for God's people, but also because of the way that it's written with quite graphic images and blunt oracles. So let's begin with a quick recap. The land of God's people has been invaded, and Ezekiel is one of a number of people who've been carried off into forced exile 1,000 miles or so away from Jerusalem in Babylon. Now that in itself can be quite confusing, because an awful lot of his visions are nonetheless set in Jerusalem, as indeed was the case today. So God is speaking through Ezekiel to tell those who are in exile, miles away from Jerusalem, what is happening and what will happen back in their home city. And God is also seeking to explain to the people in exile why they are in the state that they're in. Now, if you've been following our sermons each week, and if you haven't, you can still find those on YouTube. We first encountered Ezekiel when he had a vision of God's presence in the form of a figure that was human but wasn't human, surrounded by light and cherubim. And then we shifted from Ezekiel the vision seer to Ezekiel the preacher, as he begins to communicate God's message to the people in what we might describe today as a piece of quite profound street theatre. Well, today we are back into vision mode as Ezekiel sees something very similar to what he is recorded as having seen in chapter 1. So yep, we're back to those rather strange and somewhat obscure images of cherubim travelling on trailers of fire with wheels turning within wheels and 4 different faces and wings flapping and coals flying. And I probably haven't helped you by bringing you in halfway through in the reading. But I guess the key thing that we need to recognise is that there's a clear continuity between the vision of God that Ezekiel records in chapter 1 and the one that we read today in chapter 10. So there's a sense again of God's unchanging reign and rule over and above any human circumstances. And you may remember that when we first looked at the oracles of Ezekiel, we noticed the similarities between his visions and the visions of John in the book of Revelation centuries later in the New Testament. And so again, we're reminded that in the midst of all the turbulence and uncertainty of human experience, God is unchanging across the centuries. But the key difference with this vision is that it's now located in the temple back home in Jerusalem. When Ezekiel first saw God's glory and majesty, it was very much in his own vicinity, as if God is saying, well, you may be in exile and far away from Jerusalem, but I am still with you. God is not contained by physical space. God's rule and reign is not diminished by our immediate circumstances. But today we see what might be described as the other side of that coin. Because yes, Ezekiel does see the presence of God located in the temple of Jerusalem, but he then witnesses the sight of the glory of God departing. In fact, there's something quite tragic about the matter-of-fact way in which Ezekiel describes it in verse 19 as the cherubim leave by the east gate and pause and look back before they make their way out. God's glory is not contained by the temple. Now, that's great news when you're thousands of miles away in a very different place, to know that God can also be with you in your new circumstances. But it's bad news if your whole understanding of what it means to be God's people is tied to the place and the rituals of the temple. And it's also not good news if you've been conducting the affairs of state, or indeed running the affairs of the temple, as though God isn't there. Oh yeah, it was full of religious ritual. But as Ezekiel had discovered in the vision that leads up to what we read today, there were some pretty corrupt and self-seeking behaviours under the surface of all of that. Frankly, God was just being ignored. And this is the significant message that God's people needed to absorb. You cannot assume that God's presence will simply be contained in your rituals and your holy places. You can't just summon God up through religious activity. And perhaps more to the point, you can't hide the absence of God by simply perpetuating your religious routines. God is a free agent. We are called to do God's bidding. God is not called to do ours. And as I hinted a moment ago, we appreciate the full thrust of this message as we look over the previous couple of chapters, which you can read in your own time if you want to. But let me try and summarise them. Now, we began our service today with a psalm, Psalm 118, which is one of what are often called the festal psalms, as the people speak of the gates opening and entering into God's presence. And these psalms would often be recited as the people physically made their way through the temple courts and gateways in their great worship festivals, making their shared journey to the most holy place at the centre. That's why they're called the festal psalms or the procession psalms. And in the previous chapters, Ezekiel, as it were, has been taken by the Spirit of God on his own festal procession. But as they make their way through the various courts and gateways of the temple, the Spirit uncovers the reality of what's going on within the higher echelons of the temple cult. The Spirit reveals abusive behaviours, false narratives and religious practices, people being lied to in the search for popularity, religious leaders serving their own self-interests and lining their own pockets. And here we find another resonance with those New Testament visions of John that we find at the beginning of the book of Revelation. Because as John begins to speak, or the Spirit begins to speak through John to the churches in the light of that vision, one of the overarching messages is, I have seen. Now that is really encouraging news for those churches that are struggling and persecuted, that God is aware of their plight and their situation. But for those who become complacent and started serving their own ends, then these were words of challenge. And it's interesting that the vision of Ezekiel culminates with all these creatures covered in eyes, as though we're being reminded that God's eyes are everywhere. The all-seeing, all-knowing God is seeing what is going on in the temple. And for Ezekiel, the point is made through what we might describe as a parody of the festal procession. Because as he makes his way to the high altar, rather than being drawn into an increasing sense of holiness, he is exposed to ever more serious and disturbing shortcomings amongst God's people. And when he finally arrives at what was considered to be the most holy of places, instead of encountering the fullness of God's glory, he witnesses the departure of God's glory. Now, this is a powerful message to the people of God. The real catastrophe is not that some of your people are in exile, or that your city will be under siege, or your people are going to suffer, or the life of the city is going to be destroyed. The tragedy is that you've abandoned God's ways, and God can no longer remain present in your holy place. And God isn't leaving because the Babylonians have turned up. God is leaving because the people have abandoned his ways. And to me, this brings us to the very heart of what a prophetic ministry is all about. You know, we can debate long and hard whether God caused what happened, or whether God just allowed it to happen, or whether the actions of the people is what caused it to happen. But the purpose of the prophet is to invite people to simply ask, what is God saying to us through our present circumstances? And yet again, I cannot help but see an immense relevance to our situation as God's people today. What Ezekiel was seeing had been going on for years. It had been going on while he himself was serving as a priest in Jerusalem. But it took exile for him, and more importantly for the people that he served, to stop and truly listen to God. Now, as a priest, Ezekiel would have very much been under pressure to keep the show on the road, deliver to the people what they wanted, serve up the regular routines of ceremony and ritual. But because that had been forced to stop, there was now the opportunity for the people to truly reflect on what had been going on and to recognize the true spiritual reality of their situation. Now, I'm not suggesting that today's church is riddled with the same levels of corruption and apostasy that was highlighted in the preceding chapters of Ezekiel. But I am suggesting that we have probably displayed the same human nature. The people's first instinct was to come to Ezekiel, their priest, and say, "We want our temple back. Serve us up what we're used to." But Ezekiel the priest has been appointed by God to become Ezekiel the prophet. And his response is quite simple. You're looking for the wrong thing. The question that we need to ask is not how can we keep on going, But what is God saying to us? And in our particular exile, we now find ourselves coming to that place of return. July the 19th beckons. But what are we journeying back to? Now, I'm not suggesting that God has deserted our buildings and our gatherings while we've been away in the way that Ezekiel envisioned it. This is not a judgment call for me to make. But what I am saying is that we're reminded again that this is not about getting the show back on the road or shoring up our activities and our routines. But it's about making sure that we don't crowd out what God has to say in our hurry to just carry on where we left off. And as we recognize the human experience of Ezekiel's message, we begin to recognize the irony of what God is saying here. Because those who were in exile thought that they'd somehow lost God. They wanted to be back home again, where they could find God again in all their familiar religious life. But Ezekiel, who had already realized for himself that you can encounter God in the refugee camps of exile, is making it clear that God has long since left the building in respect of the life of home that they were longing for. Those who had been uprooted by exile had been jarred into seeking God, albeit in a very new way. And those back home are so cosseted by religious routine that they haven't even noticed how much they've abandoned God's ways. And that point is made in the early verses of the next chapter. For as God's glory departs by the east gate, he depicts a scene of a bunch of local officials arguing over a property deal, too busy pursuing their own agendas to even notice the spiritual tragedy that is passing before them. And as we place ourselves into that scene, so to speak, I suggest that the unavoidable question that it raises as we seek to now move forward is, will you be guided by the messages of exile, or do you just want the comfort of home again? Should we allow things to return to how they used to be, or has this pandemic shown us the need and the possibility of embracing change? Has the last 16 months offered us new ways of expressing our faith that we don't want to lose? Or has it made us just more determined to reclaim what we see ourselves as having lost? But in the midst of all of those questions to which there is no single answer, it seems to me that the overarching question that we all need to be asking right now is, what is God saying to us? But returning to the story of Ezekiel, the tragedy is now complete. God's glory departs, and without the glory and the presence of God, the people's religious life would just be an empty facade. In many respects, it already was. And by departing from the temple, God was simply underlining what had already become the case. And although the people's experience was painful and difficult, we see here something of the authenticity of God. For God to be glorified is to reveal God for who he truly is. And what God has been making clear for decades prior is that he's a God of justice. He's a God who detests empty ritual, a God whose heart is breaking for the plight of the poor and the downtrodden in the midst of those who are called his people. And as Ezekiel has discovered, anyone who did seek God in the religious life of the people was going to be confronted by self-interest, false messages, and corrupt practices. This is the image of God that's being projected to a watching world, and God says, I won't have it. This is not who I am. I refuse to be portrayed in these terms. I'm off. And we've got to be honest with ourselves and say that over the years of its history, the Christian church has not always portrayed an image of God that we would be particularly proud of. But we can't change the past. And the crucial question that emerges to be for each one of us is, what kind of image of God will we portray going forward? How will God be glorified in our lives? And as Ezekiel depicts the glory of God drifting towards the mountains of the east, the question that it surely raises is, will we ever see God's glory again? And that was to become a question that would haunt God's people for generations to come? Will we ever see God's glory? But years later, a man called John began to write a gospel. And its opening stanzas, he whispers those words that the people of Ezekiel longed to hear. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. And those words were uttered at a time when a new king was sitting on the throne, Herod. Herod, who built a new and impressive temple. Herod, who knew all about how to create an atmosphere of glory. Herod, who reinstated all the great festivals and jamborees that once surrounded those encounters with God's glory that Ezekiel and his contemporaries were so familiar with. And as John's story unfolds, we're constantly drawn forward, taken on a journey not dissimilar to the one that Ezekiel's vision took him on. And there's a new Son of Man, a man called Jesus. And we increasingly come to recognize that it's he who will lead us to the place where God's glory will once again be revealed. And he too journeys towards the temple. And as he gets ever nearer, he too finds himself in increasing conflict with those who oversee the rituals and the power structures of the temple's life. And eventually he arrives, and he's caught up in one of those festal processions, complete with cries of Hosanna and palm branches waved high. And there in the temple courts, he overthrows the tables of the money changers and the sacrifice vendors, and he disrupts and he disturbs its rituals, and he cries out for it once again to become a house of prayer. And then he leaves, just as the glory of God departs in the visions of Ezekiel. So Jesus departs and makes his way back to Bethany. And then, in chapter 17 of John's Gospel, we hear him utter those words. Father, the hour has come to glorify your name, for your glory and my glory to be revealed. And we're taken back to the temple. But it's not to its altar and its holy space, but to its courtrooms and its interrogation chambers, where this Jesus is confronted with false accusations and found guilty of undermining the peace and the stability of the regime that they'd created. And we're taken to its barrack rooms, where Jesus is stripped and humiliated and beaten. And once again, we leave the city. We make our way to its execution site by the road that leads from the west to the east, where Jesus is crucified. And those who witnessed this horrible, brutal, sickening and traumatic scene nonetheless can whisper to those waiting generations, we have seen his glory. It is the cross that is the foundation of our faith. Not a nice polished cross, but that place of brutal execution where the full extent of human wickedness can nonetheless reveal the extent of God's love and the extent of the hope and the salvation that we can find there. And so, what might all of this have to say to us as we find our way forward? As we recognize how the glory of God departed when the people just went off on their own religious trajectories, and how the glory of God is found in the sacrifice of Jesus? Well, let me suggest to you three things. First of all, I think we need to become a church with greater openness to God. Let me take you back for a moment to those men arguing over their business affairs as the glory of God departed by the east gate. So long as they were surrounded by the familiar walls and the temple courts, they forgot to ask or notice what God was doing or saying. It took an exile for the people to stop and to listen and to consider what God might want to communicate. And I don't think human nature has actually changed that much, if we're honest. I mean, how often does it take a tragedy for us to stop and to question God? Are we as ready to want to know what God has to say when life is going well for us? And perhaps that was true for Ezekiel. We don't really know. I mean, perhaps had it not been for the exile, he would have been content to just keep the show on the road back in Jerusalem. But in exile, far from home, He became so much more open to what God had to say. And yes, it was not an easy or a comfortable message, but at least it was God's message. And the people who gathered at his door may have been shocked and disturbed by what they encountered, but at least they gathered. And they too experienced a renewed desire to seek God, even if they then didn't always want to hear it. And perhaps one of the lessons of exile for us is to become a church with a renewed openness to what God might be saying. You know, we've learned that our faith can survive the removal of most of its earthly trappings. And so will we now have the courage and the commitment to continue to seek God and to be open to God and to listen for God and to ask what God's will and purpose for us is? Or are we just itching to simply get back to all those things that we've been doing in the name of God for years? And secondly, I think we need to be a church with greater honesty. Ezekiel's messages were difficult. And when he was led by God's Spirit, rather than his familiar routines through the courtyards of the temple, he saw the true behaviours and attitudes of the religious elite. God's Spirit revealed the truth because, as Jesus said centuries later, that's what the Spirit of God does, guides us in all truth. And when he spoke or acted out his message to the people, it was difficult and it was unpopular and it was painful, but it was honest. And as we speak again of our own experience of God's glory revealed at the cross, we're presented with a God who says, you can be honest. You don't need to hide your faults and your failings away, because here is forgiveness, here is grace, here is mercy, here is healing. And I sense that there are many in our world who, as we move forward, will need a place where they can simply be honest. And that isn't always easy in this world, because we live in a society that loves to punish and to vilify those who they see as failing. And it's a world that often demands of us a religion that just says nice things and makes everyone feel better. But we're a people of the cross. And the cross is a place of honesty, a place where we can be honest about our failings and our struggles and our fears, but a place where we can be assured that in expressing them, we can find restoration and forgiveness. And thirdly, I think we might seek to be a church with greater authenticity. As I said earlier, I don't necessarily think that we're all racked with the same levels of corruption and wrongdoing that God revealed to Ezekiel. And if we are, then it's up to us to examine ourselves in the light of what I said a few moments ago. But that moment of the glory of God becoming separate from the rituals of religion is one that I sense we would all do well to ponder just one more time. Because I sense that what we do have in common with the religious people of Ezekiel's day is that we too can sometimes assume that God's presence and God's purpose is just intrinsically linked to us running the church. And I'm not saying for a moment that God can't be present or hasn't been present in those things. But God's glory and our activities are not one in the same. And I guess that what we've all learned in recent months is that first and foremost, it is the presence of God that we need. The authentic presence of God. It's the presence of God that will define us as an authentic church. And I sense that this is what the world needs to see in us in future days. The Spirit of God revealed to Ezekiel the falsehood, the pretense and the emptiness of a religious life that had developed around the temple, but God now called for a new authenticity among his people. And I sense that we too need to recommit ourselves to be an authentic people of God, to be real in our faith, to be real in our desire to encounter God, to be real in our relationships with one another, real about our struggles and our challenges, real about our faults and our shortcomings, but also real about the possibilities of God's grace and forgiveness. We have seen God's glory, not tragically departing in the way that Ezekiel saw it, but revealed to us in Jesus, revealed in an act of brutality and sacrifice that became a place of salvation and healing. And as we seek to live in the light of God's glory, how can we be a people who are truly open to God? How can we be a people who are truly honest with God and with each other and with our world? How can we be a people who are truly authentic in our life and our faith? May God bless and guide us as we seek to live out the answers to those questions. Amen.